Islamic extremism, stronger economic ties and China's rise will all be on the agenda at the ASEAN summit that starts next week in Sydney. Now that despite several diplomatic setbacks, including Cambodian President Hun Sen's threats to beat up protesters and the Philippine leader Rodrigo Duterte's decision to pull out of the summit. Richard Heydarian is an assistant professor in political science at De La Salle University and a former policy advisor to the Philippine government. We spoke about how ASEAN nations viewed Australia's push to be part of this grouping.
Well, the summit with Australia actually comes shortly after a preceding summit between India and ASEAN leaders in actually New Delhi. And of course, a few years ago, you also had that informal summit in Sunnylands between former President Obama and the ASEAN leaders. So I think there's a feeling among ASEAN countries that major powers, including India, United States, China, Japan, and now increasingly also Australia, want to engage ASEAN. It's an affirmation of the increasing importance of the ASEAN. But also at the same time, it's also an affirmation of the increasing importance of ASEAN's relationship with Australia. In the past few weeks, there has been even discussion of Australia possibly joining the ASEAN within a decade or so. There is discussion of also the two sides deepening their strategic and economic cooperation. As you may know, ASEAN is already the third largest trading partner of Australia. It accounts for 15% of total trade with Australia. So the economic relationship is very robust. A lot of Southeast Asians are also studying here in Australia. And at the same time, of course, Australia has been also a large source of investments throughout the ASEAN, and increasingly also a source of assistance in security matters. For instance, in the case of the Philippines, Australia was a major player in helping the country to get to end the siege of Marawi by ISIS elements. So counterterrorism is another major source of engagement between ASEAN and Australia. But I think Australia and ASEAN are looking at other new areas of cooperation, possibly maritime security, and as I said, possibly even a discussion of membership in the ASEAN down the road, or some sort of a special elevated form of partnership between the two sides.
And how probable do you think that is, that a more formal recognition of Australia within this grouping?
Well, I think the region is in very uncertain times. On one hand, China's rise is now very much apparent to everyone, and that rise has not been fully peaceful. It has been destabilizing, while ASEAN countries have been very careful in terms of their language in their formal statements and interaction with China. Behind the scenes, ASEAN countries are increasingly worried of being sucked into a Chinese sphere of influence, especially in light of the fact that there are also growing uncertainties over America's commitment to the region and reliability of the Trump administration. So I think there is this recognition that middle powers in the region, that means ASEAN, Australia, Japan, India, these countries should stick to each other. And I remember last year during the Shangri-La Dialogue, Prime Minister Turnbull emphasized that in light of the uncertainty over America's commitment, in light of concerns over the rise of China and its hegemonic kind of ambitions, it's important that middle powers come together. Now, there are certain huge cultural barriers or concerns about Australia being part of ASEAN. For sure, there have been a lot of people who even scoffed at the idea of Australia considering joining ASEAN. I'm sure here in Australia also there are concerns about being part of the ASEAN. But I think some sort of special kind of partnership, some sort of a cultural partnership or community partnership between ASEAN and Australia is something that could be discussed.
Some of the concerns that there would be for many Australians, of course, would be democracy issues, human rights issues in countries like Cambodia, Malaysia, the Philippines. How much of a stumbling block might that be?
Well, without a question, democracy has been on retreat across Southeast Asia, including in countries that used to be bastions of democracy and human rights, like the Philippines. There are also concerns about autocratic nostalgia in illiberal policy, even in places like Indonesia. And the situation is much worse in Indochina, in countries like Cambodia and Myanmar. But the fact of the matter is that, Australia has been engaging with the ASEAN for a long time. Australia is part of the East Asia Summit. Australia has signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with the ASEAN. But none of this engagement actually has prevented Australia from expressing its views about democracy. And most importantly, the ASEAN, at least in its formal statement, has expressed its commitment to human dignity, to human rights and democracy. So there may be some differences in terms of interpretation of what democracy should mean in specific operational terms. But as a matter of principle, ASEAN countries and the ASEAN as an organization is not against democracy. I think Australia also has done a very good job of making sure that in terms of its diplomatic engagement with the region, it's not it doesn't seem as imposing its views. I think there's that kind of dexterity and subtlety in Australian diplomacy, and that explains why, for instance, countries like Philippines, with the President-elect Duterte who has been lashing out at the US and Western countries, actually Australia and the Philippines have a quite a robust and friendly relationship. And Australia is the only country who saw, we saw Duterte visiting their warship during the visit of an Australian warship to the Philippines last year. So I think Australia has shown its diplomatic deftness on how to deal with ASEAN countries, and that deftness will increasingly improve over the years.
So what should Australia make of Duterte's decision not to come to this conference potentially?
Well, my sources both in the Philippine government and media confirmed to me a few days ago that he's not coming. We're still trying to confirm what's the reason behind that. If, he skips Australia, that's a big thing, because Australia would have been the first Western capital for President Duterte to visit. There could be a number of reasons for him not to visit. I don't think it's a health reason. I don't think it's a distance. I mean, President Duterte was there in India. He has one of the busiest traveling schedules of any sitting leader around the world. I think his health conditions are still strong. Domestically, he's robust, his approval ratings are very high. So my hunch is his decision to skip the summit is a combination of lack of appreciation of the importance of the summit as compared to the summit in India, for instance. I think he still doesn't see how Australia could be important for for ASEAN in general. But I think more than that is also Duterte's concerns of possibly seeing protests and very negative coverage during his visit to Australia. I mean, this is a leader who gets red carpet whenever he visits countries like China or Russia, and he really detests the possibility of going to a country and facing nothing but protests and criticism. So even if the Australian government has actually quite a cordial relationship with President Duterte, a functioning, constructive relationship, I think the Australian media and members of the civil society and Philippine opposition members who are based here in Australia would have definitely staged some protests against President Duterte, and I think that's not something that is interested to see when he visits, if he were to visit Australia. So I think that explains why he skipped the decision to come, and in exchange he's going to actually speak at the Philippine Military Academy, and the military is a big constituency of President Duterte. He's really trying to reach out to the military to ensure that the armed forces are on his side as he tries to centralize power in the Philippines.
And what do you think the main issues are going to be at the summit?
Well, I think the number one issue right now that really brings ASEAN and Australia together is the threat of ISIS, spread of Islamic radicalism across the region. I think that's something whereby there's complete agreement between the two sides. There's absolutely no divergence of views. And Australia has requisite capabilities and has shown the kind of political will and diplomatic dexterity to be able to be there for ASEAN when ASEAN countries need that help. Australia is very near Indonesia, and of course, borders of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have been, unfortunately, a point of attraction for a lot of ISIS and jihadists who are now escaping the Middle East in light of the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So I think counterterrorism will be a major issue, and there will be discussion about how precisely and tangibly can Australia cooperate with countries in the ASEAN.
Good to talk, Richard. Thanks.
My pleasure, as always, to join you guys.